Good evening. My name is Sarah Couch, and this evening I will be talking about the increased risk for suicide among young adults who have a history of child maltreatment. I'm going to share my screen now. Child maltreatment and suicide risk. Child maltreatment, there are two forms, acts of commission and acts of omission. Commission is deliberate act by the caregiver or parent of a child. Acts of omission or failure to do something that you have a legal or moral obligation to do. And suicide, or the rationale behind suicide, is defined as the intentional taking of one's own life. It can be simple or complex as life itself. The person who commits suicide may see his or her actions as some sort of solution to a severe physical or psychological dilemma. Psychological abuse and neglect. Psychological abuse refers to a highly controlling and domineering relationship of parental figures with a child, including manipulation, humiliation, mind games, terrorization, cognitive disorientation, exploitation, and corruption or intentional deprivation of needs. Manipulation, both obvious and subtle, is a common way the emotionally abusive parents use to get their children to do what they want. Antipathy refers to hostility, coldness, or rejection, even scapegoating behavior shown toward the child, and at times they may be made to feel as a nuisance. Neglect refers to a distinct disinterest in the child's material and physical care, food, clothing, health, friendships, schoolwork, career prospects, and whereabouts. Physical neglect is abandoning the child. Medical neglect is defined as delaying or denying recommended health care for the child. Inadequate supervision is leaving the child unsupervised, not protected from hazards, with inadequate caregivers, or engaging in harmful behavior while with a child. Emotional neglect is isolating the child, not providing emotional support or affection. And educational neglect is failing to enroll the child in school or homeschool, ignoring special education needs, or permitting chronic absenteeism from school. Sexual abuse refers to age-inappropriate physical contact or approach of a sexual nature by any adult to the child. Stigmatization and betrayal have been identified as two key traumatogenic dynamics that are consequences of early life such sexual abuse. Feelings of stigmatization and betrayal, especially if the perpetrator is a familiar member or caregiver, and are commonly experienced by victims of early life sexual abuse. These feelings can catalyze depression, shame, and alienation from others, further undermining one's sense of self-value, self-worth, and belonging. The physical changes that occur. Neuroimaging has shown childhood abuse is associated with reduced medial prefrontal cortex volume. Given the crucial role of the medial prefrontal cortex in emotional regulation and mentalization, the reduced medial prefrontal cortex volume may further explain their persistent emotional sensitivity. Early life abuse appears to cause persistent hyperactivity of the corticotropin-releasing factor systems and alterations of other neurotransmitter systems, resulting in a heightened stress response. Parental loss refers to either parental death or separation of 1 year or more due to the parent moving and permanently living elsewhere. These life events are important considering loss due to separation and loss due to death are both risk factors for developing mood disorders. Self-criticism and depression. A self-critical personality is characterized by feelings of unworthiness, inferiority, failure, guilt, and involves a tendency to adopt a punitive self-stance once standards are not met. They're made to feel helpless and alone. They often develop an unforgiving attitude toward themselves. The interpersonal psychological theory of suicide asserts that individuals develop a desire for suicide when they perceive themselves as burdensome to others and feel isolated. This theory also holds that the acquired capability for suicide develops from repeated exposure and habituation to painful and provocative events, moving an individual from mere desire to death by suicide. In conclusion, childhood maltreatment is associated positively with suicidal behavior. It is a major public health problem worldwide, imposing huge socioeconomic burdens and increasing affected individuals' risk of mental disorders, including suicidal behavior. Emotional abuse had the strongest effect compared to those of other forms of maltreatment, according to Liu. However, in other studies by NG, found sexual abuse to be the most predisposing factor. Suicidal behavior is complex, involving genetic and environmental factors. I will end with a quote by Adele McDowell. She states that the work of the victim to overcome child abuse can take decades. It is not a straight linear path, but more of a serpentine, multi-layered exploration, where the light is practically non-existent and footing is tricky. End quote. Questions? I thank you for listening to my presentation. I hope you have a good evening.